Great, thanks very much indeed, Sonia. And the first thing that I want to do really is to pay tribute to Frances and her team for the incredible role that the trade union movement has been playing during this crisis. And I very much echo her comments around how important it is that we see a continued collaboration rather than people being divided in the pretty horrible way that we've seen recently. Look, I think this report is a must read. It accurately diagnoses how the eroded resilience of our public services has hampered our response to coronavirus, and how our fragmented and fractured labour market means many families are not economically resilient. It sets out many of the steps which must be taken to build back better as we try to pull our heads up from the awful reality of continuing deaths in our care homes and amongst our key workers and vulnerable people. Now, the report concludes, quite rightly, I think, with an acknowledgement of how Attlee's government faced up to many of the challenges of the aftermath of the Great War with confidence and ambition. And I wanted to start with Attlee and his devastating critique of Churchill's response to Labour's 1945 programme, which had accused Labour of overreaching into the rights of employers. Attlee's response was to note that he remembered when employers were free to employ sweated women workers on finishing trousers at a penny, halfpenny a pair. There was a time when people were free to neglect sanitation, so thousands died of preventable diseases. For years, he said, every attempt to remedy these crying evils was blocked by the same plea of freedom for the individual. It was in fact freedom for the rich and slavery for the poor. Well, I think we're seeing, sadly, some of the same allergy to challenging the economic status quo today. The current government's allergy to an active economic response is damaging, both in handling the crisis now and to our future recovery. Its insistence on a hands-off approach prevents our nation from dealing with the big challenges of our time, whether they're the accelerated impacts of digitisation, the climate crisis, or threats to international trade. And I think recent developments around the provision of protective equipment and testing couldn't contrast more strongly with Attlee's ambition and confidence. Our country's got some of the most sophisticated advanced manufacturers in the world, able to work alongside some of the most qualified and productive scientists on the globe. Yet, for example, when companies, often working with trade unions and local authorities, offered to help, it often took many weeks for them to receive even a single response from central government. Instead, government adopted a centralised system that struggled to deliver. We cannot squander that industrial and intellectual capacity again. Instead, we need to face up to the coordination challenges that the current crisis has revealed. And this report suggests many different mechanisms for improving coordination, to develop regional economic responses, to lessen skills deficits, and to improve workplace conditions. And action across all areas is necessary. But I want to make the point that that industrial coordination is particularly critical in the face of the climate crisis. Those nations that have started to grasp the economic opportunities from the just transition have done so through active industrial strategies rooted in the productive strengths of different regions. And just a couple of examples here. The difference in the situation for electric car charging in the UK, which is so fragmented, not coordinated. Compare that with the situation in Germany, where there's just one standard. Another, sadly, crucial current example, what's happening in UK aviation now, where we have a chaotic, job-destroying process going on with government unwilling to actively bring the different groups together, to bring employers together with trade unions and local areas to find a way forward. We need to have that coordination into the future. And it's also going to be more important if we see the headwinds around trade becoming stronger. The existing push to protectionism from the US and China may well grow and widen in scope, given the unedifying recent scramble for critical supplies in the fight against coronavirus. Suppliers closer to home may be affected too, for example, by reductions to air freight capacity. Now, instead of engaging in gung-ho rhetoric, we need to understand the preconditions required for reindustrialisation, many of which are spelled out in this report, and work to put them into place. And I think the government here is guilty of misplaced optimism. There's no reason that disruption to supply chains, either from a chaotic no-deal Brexit or from coronavirus, will necessarily lead to onshoring. They're far more likely to lead to businesses closing, more of them, and more jobs being lost. Our best chance to weather these storms and keep jobs in the UK is with an active government pursuing a clear industrial strategy. Ambition and confidence are needed here, as well as a willingness to grasp nettles and take hard choices on regulatory and investment issues. Of course, they're needed also when it comes to our fractured labour market. The strains within that labour market are being intensified with the current rise in unemployment. Government must act confidently on the furlough scheme, requiring a uniform contribution from all employers in all sectors for all workers, including those shielding. Just because it's more administratively and politically simple will massively worsen unemployment, especially without any developed sector deals. A more gradual approach would be difficult. It would involve difficult choices, but just because they're politically difficult doesn't mean that they shouldn't be made. Nor is it good enough to leave the unemployed to sink or swim on their own. The report rightly calls for an Olympic-style plan for jobs with new investment projects, but I think we need to be more ambitious. There needs to be a new social contract with those businesses asking for public support and with those granted government contracts. Yes, this should cover the creation of good quality jobs, especially for those who might otherwise struggle to find work, and it should require decent labour standards. But it should also require adherence to strong environmental standards and a commitment to build sustainable economic value. Our new social contract should reject public funds supporting short-termist payments of dividends or share buybacks and the use of tax havens to salt away public funds. Government should also have the ambition to tackle our fragmented labour market, where jobs that used to be sufficient to support a family now barely cover the bills from month to month or even week to week. If tax changes for the self-employed do indeed come forward from government, they must be accompanied by far greater security for those workers. And finally, it will of course play out against the backdrop of the very considerable debt that's been generated throughout the crisis. But again, in response to that debt, government must be ambitious for our future economic prospects, avoiding what Francis rightly called the golden oldies, although I have to say I don't think they were very golden. They were the wrong decisions taken. Putting the brakes on any recovery by diminishing our public services yet further will both dampen demand and reduce our resilience to future shocks. And loading fiscal measures disproportionately onto low and middle income people will mean many UK families will continue to struggle and lack financial resilience. This virus has demonstrated clearly social inequalities, or what Ackley referred to as unequal freedoms. We cannot continue to see these in practice in our country anymore. We keep hearing from different politicians, well, this time we really are all in it together. Well, if that's not going to be just a brazen phrase, if it's to be meant genuinely, the recovery must be a fair one, and one which harnesses the power of government, of employers and trade unions to ensure the economy realises its full potential. Okay.
Thanks so much, Anneliese. And just one question for you. If you had to say what you thought the government's biggest misstep has been on the economy so far, what would you say that it was, and what would Labour have done differently?
So I think currently it's important that we don't give the impression that there's political business as usual, that we're not in the middle of some kind of political slanging match where there's not a constructive approach being taken to these things. But of course, it's very, very important that the government gets these decisions right. And I think my major concern is that on the critical issues, government has been very slow to respond. So the furlough scheme, I'm so proud of the role of trade unions in creating that alongside businesses. But many countries had schemes like that in operation for really a very long time. We were pushing for that for a long time, very, very slow for it to be created, again, very slow to get flexibility into it. We're seeing that kind of pattern of a slow response across so many areas. Now, I know it's difficult for government. I know these are unprecedented times, but we really cannot have this cautious approach when we're looking likely to be heading towards 9% of unemployment. So I would say that slowness has been an incredible problem, but we want to work with government to get this sorted out so that people can be protected and jobs can be retained as much as possible.
Sorry, I just realised I'm still on mute. Thank you very much, Anneliese. And Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? I'll take that as a yes. Thanks very much for having me. It's very exciting to be on this panel, partly because these are such, I shouldn't say exciting times, although they sort of are, even though they're terrible times. But this is a moment where everything suddenly seems to have been thrown wide open, because this crisis this health crisis, which is also an economic crisis, I think has really highlighted problems and flaws and fractures in the economy and in society that have been there for a very long time. And the previous speakers have talked about this, the inequality, the insecurity, and the precariousness of many people, and the sort of polarized nature of the economy, where some people actually have been doing quite well and others haven't. All of this was already there. And this crisis is throwing this into even starker relief, because the people, on the whole, the people who are already struggling the most, who are hit the most from the economic fallout of this crisis. But that, I think, means that it will also reinforce the pressures for changing that, for moving towards a new social contract, as Anneliese said. So in that sense, it's a fertile moment. So this report and others like it come at a very good time, because this is when it's suddenly more possible than it has been in a while to make big social changes. Another reason for that is that, of course, a lot of disruption has already happened. And we should be honest, I think, that trying to shift the entire social model, trying to write a new social contract, inevitably involves disruption. It means doing a lot of things very differently from before. In a sort of perverse sense, it's kind of an advantage that disruption is already happening, because that means you don't have to threaten people with disruption in order to move to a better place. The disruption is already there, and we can now openly have the debate about whether we want to rebuild the status quo ante or rebuild in a better way. And I think the politics for rebuilding in a better way are very much in place. Of course, there's huge disagreements about what better means. But even before COVID, we saw a realization that things had to change in fundamental ways. I mean, it seems like decades ago, but the first few months of the Boris Johnson government saw a very different kind of Tory policy, right? Fiscal rectitude was sort of out the window, or at least sort of packed up in the cupboard in the budget. There was a whole new focus on investing in the post-industrial areas and so on. You know, maybe that was only rhetoric, but even the rhetoric had changed. So this was already, you know, the tectonic plates were shifting. And it's now up to all of us to try to think about where we want to go, because very few people, I think, will actually want to go back to the status quo ante. So the fight is on the new direction, but it will be something new. But I think for people coming from the left in particular, I think it's important to be honest about the sort of disruption that involves, even going from here. Because building a new social contract and taking into account many of the very good policy proposals that this report puts in place or proposes, that means a lot of people won't be going back to the same jobs they had. They will be going back either to jobs that are done differently, but in many cases, completely new jobs will have to be found for them, because many of the jobs that existed before are no longer sustainable because of the new health situation, but also because if you do want to have significantly higher minimum wages, more productive work, more investment, and so on, that means that people will be employed in different ways. So I think workers as well need to take in over themselves that what they go back to will not be what they had before, but somewhat better, right? We need to rethink the care sector, we need to rethink the health sector, but we also need to rethink the retail sector, the hospitality sector, these sectors that relied very heavily on fairly insecure, low-paid jobs. So that's a conversation we haven't really started having. And I would encourage the TUC and the people on this webinar to take that on board. This is an excellent report that really deserves to be read, but I think it's only the start, and I think we need to own up to how implementing some of these proposals actually demands a lot of adjustment, also by those whom it will help. And related to that, I think it's important, and this I thought was a bit missing in the report, we need to think about the productivity effects of creating a fairer social structure, partly because that's important sort of on the merit to understand the economic effects, but partly I think for political reasons. If we're really going to build a new social contract, you need pretty much all parts of society to be on board with that. you had that in 1945, right? To make this a 1945 moment, you need to broaden the conversation enough that, of course, it's important to do right by those who have been treated badly in the past and have suffered the most from this economic fallout. But let us also talk about how that affects the economic model as a whole. And I think there's a good story to tell there. I think things like a higher minimum wage, I think things like greater worker involvement, some of the main pillars in the proposal in this report, those can be good for overall productivity, because the sort of precarious low-paid jobs that this country in particular, more than other European countries, has relied on, they are unproductive jobs, right? They're not a good use of human potential. So I think it's important to tell a broader story about how doing right by the left behind and the worst off is also a way of increasing productivity in the economy overall. So I'm kind of encouraging you all to try to frame this not as a zero-sum game. Labor versus capital is always a conflict and will always be there. But my view, at least, is that this doesn't have to be a zero-sum game, and both in terms of the quality of the proposals and the political chance of success, you do better by looking at how this sort of thing can benefit everybody, not just the direct beneficiary. Now, in order for sort of big new social model that does better by those at the bottom to actually have these good productivity effects, there are a couple of things beyond fairness, if you like, that I would add to what's in this report. Some of it is in there, and actually, like, maybe when we get back to discussion, Francis can maybe talk a little bit more about it. Training and skills upgrades, we really need to talk more about that. That's in the report, so let's have some of it out in the discussion. But if I'm right that a new social contract means a lot of different jobs, means that a lot of people have to shift from what they have been doing to what they ought to be doing in a better society, that also means equipping people to do that. That may mean fewer people, but more machines, more automation in manufacturing, for example, right? It may mean, in various businesses, a focus on quality rather than quantity. What does that mean in terms of the sort of training and skills that workers need? So we really need to talk much more and much more concretely about how that is done. And the second part I think we need to talk more about is the sort of broad macroeconomics, because we are going to come up to a situation with huge debt overhangs, both in the public sector and in the private sector. A lot of these rescued companies will have much higher debts coming out of the crisis than going into the crisis. And we know that debt is a disincentive to invest, it's a disincentive to expand, and in the public sector it has been seen as an incentive to fiscally consolidate. We know, of course, from the last crisis, and this really should be broadly accepted now, that austerity can be counterproductive even from a debt point of view. If you shrink or if you hold back the productive base and the economy from which you want to repay debts, even on the narrow goal of making debt sustainable, you may be failing. But that means we have to have a good narrative, a good story, a good argument about why it's important to have what some American economists call a high-pressure economy, right? You need to keep demand stimulus on for quite a long time. That needs to be part of the discussion here. And that means, this is my last point, that organizations like the TUC need to have an answer to how they, it's, you know, you're going to sigh when you hear this, but how do you pay for it, right? We need to have that conversation and not shy away from it. That's not really touched on in this report, which is fine, but at least talk about it elsewhere. So I would like to see a discussion about how we pay for it, how we paid for demand stimulus. Partly the answer is it pays for itself. There's a little bit of that in the report. If you manage to have strong growth and more productive jobs, higher productivity, higher quality jobs, that does produce more national income, and that is a part of what you pay the debt with. But we also do need to talk about the public revenue side of things. So if the tax system is going to change, and both Francis and Anneliese touched on this, But I think as part of this conversation of how a new social contract looks, there needs to be a pretty open discussion about which taxes are going to go up and maybe which are going to go down. In my own view, helping people into newer, better jobs probably involves cutting some taxes on the labor side, reducing the tax wedge, reducing maybe the various taxes on labor and employment, but increase others in return. So could we have a conversation about wealth taxes? Could we have a conversation about how we tax capital and so on? All of this really needs to be out in the open, so that we, there are maybe some free lunches in the economy, but at least we should be honest about what we think they are and own up to where things have to be paid for. So those are some kind of additions from my point of view. But on the whole, this report is very good. It should be read by everyone. There are a lot of things in there that, the FT editorial column, for example, would not disagree with. One of our best read editorials in the last month, or actually ever, was one that called for a new social contract. So, I sort of speak from experience when I say everyone's sort of on board with things have to change. But of course, the big question is how. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much again for having me, and do everyone read the report.
Thanks so much, Martin. Right, well, we've got loads of questions to work through, so thanks very much to everyone who's typed into the box. I'm trying to sort of loosely group them, so bear with me. And the first set of questions that I've got really sort of relates to movement building. So we've got a question from EC, and they say, where is the strategy to massively increase union membership and labour membership? They don't see much action, and they think it's a prerequisite for a 1945 style sort of settlement. It's a good question there. Related to that, we have a question from Ian Lawrence, which is what specifically to Francis, what is a TUC going to be doing to help promote the worth of trade unions and recruitment to trade unions? So I think those are good questions for both Anneliese and Francis. And thirdly, just a question that I would add into that, which is really around we've already seen a strong political thrust for sort of austerity from some parts of the political spectrum, which Martin kind of alluded to. And maybe this is sort of a question for all three of you, but maybe particularly Martin could reflect on this. What are the lessons from sort of 10 years of largely unsuccessful countering of austerity, sort of campaigns to counter austerity? I mean, there have been some successes, don't get me wrong, but it certainly hasn't kind of taken us away from the main political thrust. So maybe if we could go to Francis first on those questions.
Sorry. The disruption that Martin was talking about is as true for the trade union movement as it is for any other organisation in society. And clearly we are very focused on trying to minimise the triggering of mass redundancies, which will clearly hit membership, as well as people's own lives and families. But also we have seen very significant numbers of people joining unions in other areas. But I think what's really important for us to acknowledge is that, of course, naturally, the vast majority of people are joining online, and particularly young workers, I think, have a very different expectation of trade unionism. They live and work through their smartphones, and yet trade unionism is not there yet. We've got a big festival for organising in the summer, and there'll be details of that very soon. It will be held online and showcasing some of the best examples in Britain, but around the world, of how trade unions have created new models of organisation, particularly for the young insecure. The TUC has done work on that, Ian knows that, looking at what people want from trade unionism, everything from how do we support and organise to what should the pricing structure be for union dues. So I think we have to be, I've long argued that we need to take our own big leap in terms of switching our investment into digital organising and digital trade unionism. I think that this crisis has maybe forced our hand. We've got to do it. There is no choice now. And there are lots of really positive lessons about how we build workers' power. For me, there's no substitute for people coming together and using our collective strength to bargain for a better deal at work. But we've got to open our eyes and be a bit more imaginative and 21st century about how we do that, because I'm pretty sure that the original new unionism pioneers would have grabbed every opportunity that digital gives us to find new ways to win.
Great, thanks, Frances. Anneliese?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with what Frances said there. I suppose just a couple of quick additional reflections. I think it's absolutely right that the role of unions has been brought home to enormous numbers of workers in a way that has not occurred for a very long time. And clearly people are very much reliant on their union, especially now with the return to work in many sectors. It's a critically important one. I mean, I think I've been trying to underline to government, you know, in the same way that puppies aren't just for Christmas, unions aren't just there to help you, in particular, create a furlough scheme. They need to be an embedded, institutionalized part of the process. You know, these are two important questions to be having an uncoordinated approach. I think we've seen some of the dangers of that uncoordinated approach around some of the recent issues with the return to different workplaces. I think we will see them in different sectors. We'll see them around changes to the furlough scheme. We need to have that national coordination. I think that's really important because it will then lead to people being able to see the concrete impact of being in a union. I think that's been raised already. It's a higher level in the public consciousness, but it needs to become even stronger. And just lastly, I would say, you know, I've always tried to indicate the difference between the UK and other countries in this regard. You know, did a piece contrasting the approach to safety in the UK to that in Germany, for example. Not only is the guidance there much more emphatic, but there's a consistently embedded role for trade unions through works councils, etc., that's very forward-looking, that's embedded into the future. And that, along with greater representation generally in business, is critical for safety, but it's critically important for some of those productivity issues that Martin was talking about as well, because when you've got a more engaged workforce with those mechanisms for engagement with management, you tend to have more productive work. Oh, and then, sorry, Sonia, you asked about the lessons from austerity and that movement. I mean, I think, first of all, there's been a myth that's circulated over the last 10 years, which is that, well, we've got through this, and actually, for most people, it was okay. Yes, there may have been what some politicians call austerity, and you know, that obviously had an impact on our public services, but for most people, we've been okay. Well, actually, the evidence is contrary to that. We've had the longest stagnation in living standards for 8 generations over the last 10 years. This is a period where fiscal decisions have pulled demand out of the economy, and they've protected the very best of people with tax cuts, and profitable companies in many cases with tax cuts as well, while others have struggled. So there must be different decisions taken around this recovery, and we're already trying to clearly create that framework so we have a different debate around these questions than we did after the last financial crisis.
Thanks, Anneliese. Martin?
Well, just to follow up on the question about austerity, I agree with Anneliese. We know that fiscal consolidation, there are sort of 2 types. You can raise taxes or you can cut spending. Here it was mostly cutting spending, and that's sort of what we understand by austerity. But either way, if you take demand out of the economy in a weak demand environment, then you will slow down growth, and that will actually make the public debt burden look worse. It was, you know, bad-ish here. It was even worse in Southern Europe and some other places. I think a lot of people have learned some of that lesson, even if they won't admit it. There is, in this sense, a free lunch in that if you push high growth, you actually make the debt problem, the debt challenge, to the extent there is one, somewhat easier to bear because, again, the productive base from which you service the debt grows faster. And this effect is actually bigger the higher your initial debt coming into a crisis. So hopefully that will not be missed on the people who decide this time around. I wanted to add the sort of micro consequences of fiscal consolidation. Again, it depends on where you cut or which taxes you increase. But in practice, and especially in this country, austerity or fiscal consolidation took the form of public sector austerity, of squeezing public services, some protection for health. But that can have consequences for the productivity of the economy. If you, for example, you think you economize on active labor market policies to help people move into better jobs, if you economize on the enforcement of various rules in the economy, if you economize on tax collection, all of these things are actually losses. There are some false economies involved in cutting public spending, at least in countries where you have relatively low public spending to begin with, which is true for the UK in a European context. I wanted to just add something to what was said earlier about the role of unions, because I think my role on this panel is probably to be slightly heretical. So let me say something heretical about unions. I mean, there is a risk, I think, that the interest of the movement and the interest of the social contract and those at the bottom of the economy aren't completely aligned, because some of these very good policies set out in the report, for example, make it less necessary for people to join a union, right? This is why in the Nordics, unions have always been against minimum wages, because then what's the benefit from joining the union? So this is a bit of a paradox, especially when unions don't have very high membership. But I would just encourage the TUC, like in this report, to think of the public good they perform, regardless of whether it incentivizes people to join them or not. The other possible problem is that it's sometimes hard for unions, either locally or in the aggregate, to be on board with a sort of reallocation that a new social contract requires. So if people are going to shift jobs, if some companies are going to go out of business or just restrict the jobs they have, and you have to create other jobs somewhere else, that's not all that easy for a union to deal with, because it means some people will lose their jobs. Ideally, you have policies in place that means that there are plenty of new and better jobs to go to. And the trade unions can have a big role to play in that. And in the countries where they play the most constructive role, they do. In the Nordics, in Germany, the unions will be on board with increasing automation, increasing productivity, even if that, in a narrow sense, may threaten some jobs. But it's not an easy place for a union to be. So I just want to put that on the table and encourage you to look to the greater good.
Brilliant, thanks Martin. So we've only got about 15 minutes left, so I think what I'm going to do, there's sort of three other themes that I'd really like to draw out the questions. So I think I'm going to draw those themes out and then put it out to each of the three speakers, and that probably will take us some way towards 11. It's just a way of trying to make sure that as many questions get asked as possible. So the first set of questions are really about public ownership and outsourcing. So we had a question from John Tizard, who asked the speakers to comment on the impact of outsourcing on the response to COVID and whether this can contribute to a campaign for insourcing. And we've seen all sorts of failures on PPE, on contact tracing, etc. And related to that, Sam Mason says he's had a quick read of the report and he doesn't think it makes enough mention of public ownership. So it would be good to get thoughts on that. So that's one set of questions. We've had another question, a second theme from Michelle Fry, and she talks about Jacinda Ardern raising the 4-day week as a possibility of a way for companies to assist with the recovery, something I'm really interested in. I've also looked at the issue of universal basic income. So there are these kind of newish economic ideas doing the rounds, and I wonder what the panel thinks about what role they've got to play in the recovery. And then the third theme were really kind of specific questions about sectors that we already know there are massive problems with exploitation and working conditions. So we've got Mark Mizzen, who's asked about the 10,000 workers working in modern slavery conditions in Leicester. what's going to happen to them coming out of this. And we have a really good question from Susan Miller, I think it is, can't read my own handwriting, and she sort of said she's asked for more discussion from the panel on care. So what does a decent care strategy actually look like in terms of both supporting key workers but building our social and economic resilience as a society? So that's quite a lot to throw at our three speakers, but it'd be really great if you could take sort of about 3 minutes each to address each of those three issues, if that's okay. And I'll keep an eye on time, so I know we don't want to go on too much past 11. So Anneliese, I'll come to you first this time.
Sure, thank you very much, and thanks so much for the points people have made. And I would say if there's any that are kind of specifically directed at me that you haven't had a chance to go through, Sonia, please do get in contact with me. I want to hear from people about their comments. First of all, around public ownership and outsourcing, I agree this has been incredibly damaging to our response. You know, just today we saw some of the issues that there have been with Serco around contact tracing, and we've been consistently trying to say to government, look, work with those organisations that are already there, local authorities, local public health leads, GPs, etc. They're trained in these activities already. They need additional capacity and they need the funding to do it. But if they're empowered to deliver this, working with, you know, in many cases, potentially local, different forms of local delivery, they will be able to actually achieve the test, track and trace capacity that is really fundamental, and without which we're not going to be able to shift out of lockdown in many sectors, or we may well see it being reimposed. And quite frankly, if countries like South Korea can do that so effectively from the beginning, then we should be doing it in the UK. Rachel Reeves in the Labour team in particular out today making these arguments yet again to Gove. Secondly, around the points about kind of new economic ideas, I mean, I think first of all around the kind of shortened week, I mean, this has obviously been part of the discussion around the furlough scheme as well, where we've been saying that a more flexible approach needs to be taken. You know, I appreciate it was difficult at the beginning, there was pressure on to get it out the door as quickly as possible, but we really shouldn't be having to wait until the beginning of August for a more flexible scheme to enable people to start coming back to work part-time and with different hours. I actually think there's a much broader conversation as well, which is one that reflects the nature of caring responsibilities that people have. You know, very often I'm frustrated by a debate about living standards which only focuses on pay. You know, I know the TUC doesn't do that, but if we only focus on pay, we miss out all of those people who rely on social security to top up their income currently. So I think it is an area that we really need to get into. Around universal basic income, obviously there is a debate around that, that proposal currently. I think that it's possible that one might want to look at, as a demand stimulating measure in the future, some form of transfer to individuals. But I'm always aware that, you know, it's those who are on lower incomes who will be more likely to immediately spend so-called marginal utility. They will be more likely to spend that money that they receive. So it's more effective to make sure that those who are on, you know, low and middle incomes receive that support. But secondly, I think this is linked to the whole debate around taxation as well. We don't have currently a sufficiently progressive tax system. You know, when you take into account things like capital gains, asset wealth, etc., and how that's been comparatively protected over recent years, you know, we need to see changes in these areas, and I think that will be necessary until we move into any kind of a space where you had a very, very different approach to social security like that. And finally, on the different sectors, I mean, I agree with the risks in particular areas. I think, you know, a real worry for me is the limited strength of the Health and Safety Executive, the fact that it's seen millions pulled out of its budget over recent years, and obviously there's been confusion around whether it can conduct those spot checks or not. That needs to be sorted out as a matter of urgency. And then, of course, we do need to be looking at different sectors differently, and people will have heard Keir's comment saying that, you know, those people who were last now they're first. They're first in terms of our response to this crisis. Those care workers, many of whom not even earning the living wage, not even remotely, people who do the most important job in many cases that I can think of in incredibly difficult circumstances. We need to have a new settlement in the future. That means having a serious conversation about how we, again, appropriately fund social care, how we stop passing the buck onto local authorities who can't afford to put the right money in, and we actually have a responsible discussion about proper funding into the future, as well as those strong protections for workers in those industries.
So I've just seen on the chat, someone has asked how they should get in touch with you with any questions, and very kindly said that I probably don't want to function as your inbox. So maybe you can either type that in your office email, or we can liaise with the TUC and get that out to attendees afterwards. Right, Martin, I'm going to come to you, and then I'm going to give the last word to Francis. So Martin first.
Thanks very much. Let me just very quickly follow up on what I said before, because I've seen some questions or follow-ups and criticisms on the chat. So just to give a very, very concrete example of what I have in mind in terms of the challenge for unions. Suppose you won a victory for much higher minimum wages, significantly higher minimum wages, and an end to unpredictable shifts. End to 0-hour contracts and requirements on shift patterns being decided in advance and being reasonable and so on. That would be very good. It would also mean that a bunch of jobs in hospitality and in retail would not be economically viable for those businesses, and they would disappear. So all I'm saying is you need to be willing to accept those consequences and focus on what you do then to promote policies that create jobs elsewhere. But it's just very natural for a union to want to protect jobs as well as work conditions. In a big shift to a better social contract, that will be a conflict in cases. So I'm just calling on you to not hide from that possible trade-off. We want to encourage shifts into other better jobs, not holding on to jobs that can't be held on to. In terms of the questions that Sonia raised, very good questions. There was one on public ownership and outsourcing. Governments have a lot of power. They have a lot more power than they have tended to be willing to use. And public ownership is only one of many, many ways to affect how production is done, how the economy works. And I think on the whole, not a particularly convincing one. Personally, I don't see any kind of inherent reason for insourcing or providing things through public ownership if there are other tools that can get you the results you want just as well. And two tools to start with are, this was mentioned by either Francis or Anneliese, is to just have as a requirement for accessing public procurement contracts or accessing public subsidies that certain behaviors are not accepted. Tax havens, perhaps something on work conditions. There's just so much that can be done in contracting. Start with hiring some really good lawyers to make sure that the government's contracts and policy eligibility for private companies are strict and don't have these perverse consequences. That's an easy thing to do when you think about it, and it would probably have a lot of effect. A second thing that the government can do, and this relates to the third question about modern slavery and work conditions, is enforcement. There are a lot of good laws on the books that are not in practice being enforced, and everyone on this webinar knows more about that than me because you're active out there and seeing the workplaces. But it's obvious to everyone that even the sort of weaker protections that the UK has compared to other European countries are not being enforced. And that's another thing that a government can easily do, and that, to my mind, has a lot more prospect for good consequences than taking things into public ownership. I'm not convinced that the UK state would have been very good at maintaining a stockpile, a pandemic stockpile, say, than it has been in practice when some of this was privatized. I don't know. I wouldn't trust it, to be honest, to be able to do that well. So let's not sort of assume that insourcing will automatically lead to better results. It might actually hide misbehavior and poor competence more than what you can do if you have private companies that are held to strict standards and enforcement. Finally, new exciting economic policy proposals, in particular UBI, Universal Basic Income, I'd like us all to imagine how going into this the economic aspect of the crisis would have been if we'd had a UBI in place. I think it would have been infinitely better. We would have been in such a much better place if UBI had been the mainstay of the benefit system today. It would have been easy to tune up if you needed to. You would have already had a system in place to reach everyone. This is a particular problem in the Anglo-American economies, in the UK and the US, that there are a lot of people who are sort of outside the system and not reached. So I'm very much in favor of a UBI. And I think that if you had a UBI, or in a world where you have something like UBI, the attractiveness of some of these other policies, I think, wanes a little bit. And a minimum job guarantee, I don't see so much the benefit if you actually have a UBI in place. I think what is important about UBI that we don't talk enough about, apart from securing incomes, and better than a minimum income guarantee, which kind of traps you at a low level because you lose it if you then start making more, is that it empowers individuals, right? It gives people an ability to say no at work and leave if they are mistreated. I mean, they shouldn't be mistreated. The government should be there for them anyway, but it will happen. And it helps a lot to have the fallback security, basic security that means you can say no. Being able to say no is kind of the core of individual empowerment. And this is sort of one of my main reasons for being in favor of UBI, even though it wouldn't always be super generous. It would, in some cases, make some people worse off compared to the current benefit system. But it would uniquely, I think, create this empowerment by always allowing people to say no. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Martin. I'm a bit of a UBI skeptic, so this is a point at which I wish that I was a participant rather than a chair, but I'm going to do my job as chair. Francis, I'm going to hand those questions over to you. There's just one more that I wanted to add to you specifically that has come in since, which is from Balgisa Sheikh Ahmed. And she raises a concern about potential union rigidity and raises this point about there being tensions between different segments of workers and changes in who workers are today versus tomorrow. And she says that's why the voice and representation of all workers is important, and how can unions choose those workers who are currently marginalised, who aren't members of unions. You know, we know that unions are more likely to represent better paid professionals. How can we show them that workers' organisations can be a useful, inclusive space for marginalised workers as well?
Well, I think we were talking about new ideas. I think it may not be a new idea, but how we reinvent collectivism for the 21st century, I think, is our central challenge. And, you know, Martin was talking about individual worker choices. I'm afraid, certainly just all my experience, including my own working life, is that individuals have very little power. It's not an equal relationship with the boss as an individual, even with, and I'd be very interested to know what the figure for the universal basic income would be, because frankly, if that was 95 quid a week, then that doesn't give you too many choices either. But, it's collectivism that allows us to negotiate the real differences there can be and to come up with solutions for the greater good. And I think that's essentially, all trade unions is about friendship between working people, looking after each other, sticking up for each other. And the stronger we are, the more we can do that. There are so many, we made, just to give a really small practical example, but we made the offer to government and employers. We have tens of thousands of trained and accredited health and safety reps, huge experience. Anybody who knows one will know that this is wisdom from the shop floor, very practical. How do we make workplaces safe? So for sure, we need more inspectors, but why couldn't we release those health and safety reps down supply chains into unorganised workplaces to make sure that all workers are safe? That offer is still on the table. On the skills, we've been arguing for a long time. Why don't we have a national retraining scheme so that every worker can get basic advice about, to follow each of our dreams about progressing at work, becoming, getting the vocation, the career, the skill, whatever it is that we want. Technology, again, provides huge opportunities to do that on a mass scale. And imagine the different situation we would have been in if all those millions of furloughed workers during their downtime could easily access free training and opportunities to upgrade and reskill. Again, practical stuff. And in terms of these big transitions that without doubt we're going to see in society as much as the economy, it's the trade union movement globally that has argued for a just transition. We are absolutely up for a carbon-free economy, but let's do it in a way that doesn't end up with working people paying the price, that does have tailored support to allow people either to transform their firms, which sometimes gets forgotten about, or transfer into new jobs. Just in terms of the business model, because again, I think we do have to be frank about this. And for me, Carillion was one of the worst examples of a business model that was, built on the back of, frankly, low-paid and insecure labour, false self-employment, and yet, its key source of money was government procurement. Why wasn't government using that power to shift standards upwards at a really basic level? But I think there is something fundamentally flawed about the short-termism, even in its own terms, of thinking you can just sweat labour, maximise profits, and then what happens? Ultimately, we end up with it falling apart. So, I do want, and by the way, I think it's also a responsibility of us as unions, and it's one of our key bargaining objectives, is to win back direct employment so that government and employers are not able to not just outsource workers so easily, but outsource any responsibility and accountability for what happens down the chain. And some of those big changes, when the minimum wage was introduced, we were told that was going to destroy civilization, destroy millions of jobs and so on. It didn't. All the international evidence is, yes, you can make that short-termist choice of sweating labour, working people into the ground for a pittance, or you can take the high road to productivity. And actually, I believe that high road is more sustainable. And just finally, on the care strategy, because I think it says something really profound about a society when the majority of workers caring for elderly and disabled people are on less than £10 an hour, when they're talked about by some politicians as being unskilled, and when the majority are women and so many come from other countries to do that work, that the value that or the lack of value placed on that workforce tells us something very profound about the lack of value and respect we give to our elders in this society. And these are our mums and dads and grannies and granddads that we're talking about. It's got to change. It has got to change. We advocate absolutely a national care service, and I think we do have to talk about how we pay for it. A while ago we did a TUC poll on tax, and actually found that most people are prepared to pay a bit more for the NHS and for a decent social care system, but as long as they are confident that those with the broadest shoulders are paying their fair whack too. And I think that's pretty fundamental, because we know that actually it's not income, it's wealth that is the biggest driver of inequality. And so we are going to have to grasp these nettles. And, everybody talks fair taxes. Well, let's see some action.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Francis. We had one really good question come in from Derek Meller that we obviously don't have time to address, but I'll just mention it because I haven't heard that many people talking about it. It's about how health and safety reps, and of course the government's enforcement teams as well, to the extent that they exist, but how will they make workplaces safe when more and more trade union members are working from home, a looming organisational issue? I think that's a really good point. We've had loads of positive comments in the group chat, so huge thank you to the TUC for hosting us, especially to Francis, Anneliese and Martin for their contributions. I think they've been really good. Some of the comments that we've had include from Kerry Williams, who says, excellent panel, webinars are great for including people outside the N25 and long may they continue. Point from Kerry there, so thank you very much for that. And finally, all that it remains to say is a huge thank you to all of you for attending as well. I think even though it's been online, actually it has meant that we've been able to include lots of people who might not have been able to attend otherwise, and it's been a really rich discussion, but also really brilliant questions from our audience, and I'm just sorry that we didn't have time to get to all of them. But thank you all very much for attending. I know the message from the TUC will be watch this space, as I think there'll be lots more to come. Thank you very much.
Well done, Sonia.
Pleasure.
Thanks very much. Bye. Thanks to Anneliese and Martin too. Bye.
Of course.
Thank you so much for having me. Great discussion.
Great.
Everyone should really read the report. Do read the report.
Oh yeah, and I forgot the plug for your book, Martin. Sorry, I was going to say that as well.
I've put it in the chat, so don't worry. Completely unashamed.
Absolutely.
See you. Bye.
Bye.
Run.